Chapter 1: A Statement of Power. The air in the Creedmoor Zoological Gardens was a physical weight. It carried the scent of a century of wet rot, of soil that had never seen proper sun, and of something acrid underneath, like old iron and forgotten blood. Julian Croft breathed it in, a connoisseur of decay. He ran a gloved hand over the wrought iron archway, its filigree choked with a rust so deep it seemed organic. "Magnificent," he said, his voice a low hum against the oppressive silence. "The entire park is a panopticon, the pathways, the sightlines. Every enclosure was designed to be observed from a central point." He gestured toward a squat, two-story stone building that commanded the crest of the hill. The founder's office, the eye of the storm. Maya Jensen lowered her camera, the red recording light a single point of warmth in the gray afternoon. "A statement of power, got it. Ben, are you getting any usable audio? Or is it just wind and Julian's history lesson?" Ben Akoro stood apart from them, near what was once the Congolese enclosure. A shallow, dry moat separated the path from a series of concrete platforms meant to resemble a riverbank. He adjusted the fuzzy windscreen on his boom microphone, but his attention was elsewhere. He watched the building on the hill. He had come here for a reason separate from Maya's documentary, a reason that coiled in his gut. A name from a faded ancestry document, Kosa. Died Creedmoor Gardens, 1891. Cause: failure to thrive. A sterile, dismissive epitaph for a man stolen from his home. "The air is dead," Ben said, his voice quiet. "There are no birds." Zara Nader, the locksmith they hired for what she called non-destructive entry, jangled a heavy ring of tension wrenches. "The main office is stone and iron. If you want inside, it's going to make some noise. The city permit covers historical survey, not a break and enter. It won't be breaking and entering if the lock is a century old and you simply persuade it," Julian countered, a thin smile on his face. He was already moving up the overgrown path, his strides long and certain. "Creedmoor's office is a time capsule. We have to see what's inside." The building was a fortress in miniature. Thick oak doors, banded with iron, sat within a heavy stone archway. A single name was carved above it, Augustus Credmore. The letters were filled with a dark, almost black moss. Zara set her toolkit on the ground and began to work. She selected a pick and a wrench, inserting them into the massive keyhole. For several minutes, the only sounds were the faint scratching of metal on metal and the whisper of the wind through the skeletal branches of the trees. Ben kept his gaze on the upper floor window of the office. He saw a flicker of movement, a distortion, like heat rising from pavement just for a second. He blinked, but it was gone. "The pins are corroded solid," Zara grunted, applying pressure. "This isn't a job of finesse." She switched tools, inserting a heavy piece of steel into the lock. With a sharp twist, a loud crack echoed across the grounds. The door groaned inward an inch. There, persuasion. The air that rolled out of the office was different. It was not the scent of outdoor decay, but of sealed dust, dry paper, and something else. A faint, cloying sweetness like old perfume or pressed flowers. Maya pushed past Zara, her camera's light cutting a clean cone through the gloom. "Lighting, Ben. I need the big panel." The room was immense, a cavern of dark wood and leather. A massive desk carved from a single piece of mahogany faced the door. Behind it, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned with leather-bound volumes. Glass display cases held scientific instruments, brass sextants, polished obsidian spheres, and complex, multi-lens devices Julian couldn't immediately identify. Everything was coated in a uniform layer of gray dust, so thick it softened every sharp edge. The dust was a shroud. Julian walked directly to the desk, his footsteps silent on the thick Persian rug. Incredible, it's completely preserved. He must have sealed it himself before he died. Maya panned her camera across the room, her lens finally settling on the far wall. Or he wanted to make sure nobody could get to that. The object was a brute, a colossal iron safe set into the stonework like a burial vault. It was 6 feet tall, its surface pitted and dark, with a single, complex combination wheel in the center. "Zara, thoughts on that security?" Maya asked, her voice tight with excitement. Zara stepped close to the vault. She ran her bare fingers over the iron plate, her touch professional and assessing. She rapped her knuckles against it. The sound was a dull, final thud. Pre-WWI construction, thick steel, riveted, not welded. If Creedmoor put something in there, he meant it to stay put. You'd need dynamite to open this, or a week of drilling. Ben remained near the office entry, his microphone held loosely at his side. He watched the air inside the room. The dust motes didn't drift randomly. They seemed to move in slow, deliberate currents, swirling into patterns that almost made sense before dissolving. He looked up. A heavy, multi-bladed ceiling fan hung from the ornate plaster medallion. It was motionless, yet he heard a faint sound from above. A dry, rhythmic clicking. "Look at this," Julian said, his voice hushed with reverence. He was crouched by the wall near the desk. He had found a small, ornate ventilation grate. It was loose. Prying it open with his fingers, he reached inside. His arm went up to the elbow before he grunted with effort. He pulled out a large, leather-bound volume thick with age and dust. He blew a plume of gray from its cover, revealing gold-leaf lettering. AC his journal. The moment the book came into the light, the office door behind Zara slammed shut. It was not the sound of a door swinging on its hinges, but a solid, percussive impact, as if a battering ram had struck it from the outside. A heavy, grinding sound of metal shearing metal followed. The brass handle, which Zara had broken, snapped completely, the pieces clattering on the stone floor. Zara spun around, her professional calm shattered. What caused that? She threw herself at the door, pulling at the splintered wood where the handle used to be. The door did not move. She slammed her shoulder against the oak twice. It was like striking a wall of solid rock. The bolt, it didn't slide, it fired. The mechanism is destroyed. The tumblers shattered internally. She turned to face the others, her face pale in the beam of Maya's camera. "We are locked inside this room." Julian clutched the journal to his chest. Ben stared at the ceiling, where the dust cloud was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to rotate in a counterclockwise direction. The clicking sound had stopped. The room was utterly silent. Chapter 2: The Resonance of Misery. Panic was a cold, sharp thing. For a full minute, The only sound in the office was Zara's labored breathing as she fruitlessly examined the seams of the heavy door. She pulled a small, powerful flashlight from her kit, running its beam over the frame, the hinges, the shattered lock plate. "The bolt is a drop bar," she said, her voice tight and strained. "It's an internal mechanism. When the lock was forced, it must have triggered a failsafe. A deadfall, it's not locked. It's barricaded from the inside." She kicked the door, a useless, angry gesture that produced a dull thud. "This isn't a room, it's a vault." Maya kept her camera trained on Zara, then swung it to Julian, who was wiping the journal's cover with his sleeve. "Keep rolling," Maya muttered to herself, a mantra of professionalism against the rising tide of fear. "Julian, open the book. If we're stuck in here, we might as well find out why." Julian placed the heavy volume on the desk, the action strangely formal in the tense atmosphere. The leather cover was dry and cracked. He opened it carefully. The pages were thick, high-quality vellum, covered in an elegant, spidery script of faded brown ink. The first page was not a date or a greeting, but a statement. "Read it out," Maya commanded, moving closer to frame the page over his shoulder. Julian cleared his throat. His voice was steady, but it was the forced steadiness of a lecturer, not a man at ease. "The body is a cage of flesh," he read, "but the soul is a resonant instrument. To hear its music, one needs only the correct acoustic environment and sufficient pressure. Misery is the bow, pain is the string. This park, this grand menagerie, is not a collection of specimens. It is my orchestra." A heavy silence followed the words. Ben took an involuntary step away from the desk. The sentence hung in the air, grotesque and alien. "This isn't a zookeeper's journal," Ben said, his voice barely a whisper. "This is something else." "He was a madman," Zara spat, turning away from the door. "A poet with a god complex. It means nothing. We need to find another way out. The window." She moved to the large plate-glass window that overlooked the decaying park. It was a single, thick pane of Victorian glass, warped and rippled with age. The frame was heavy iron bolted directly into the stone walls. She pushed against it. The frame didn't budge. She inspected the edges, looking for a latch or seam. There was none. It was a solid, sealed unit. "This window was never meant to be opened," she concluded, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "It's a display case. We are the exhibit." As she spoke, Ben saw it again, the shimmer. A distortion in the air near the corner of the ceiling just above one of the towering bookshelves. It was more defined this time, a vertical line of warped light like a splinter of heat haze. It was utterly silent, utterly still. He felt a strange sense of recognition, a cold dread that had nothing to do with being trapped. It was ancient. "Julian," Maya pressed, ignoring Zara's despair. "Keep reading." Julian turned the page. The script continued, dense and meticulous. Creedmoor writes about something he calls sympathetic resonance. It's a twisted application of physics. He believed that if you placed a person in an environment that mimicked their homeland, their spirit would resonate with a specific frequency. And if that spirit was subjected to extreme stress, fear, loneliness, sickness, the frequency would amplify. He wasn't just displaying people, he was tuning them. He trailed off, his finger tracing a complex diagram on the page. It showed the layout of the zoological gardens, but the enclosures were labeled with musical notations instead of geographic regions. The founder's office was at the center, marked with a symbol that resembled a human ear. "He's writing about acoustics," Julian breathed, a horrified awe in his voice. The shapes of the enclosures, the materials used. It was all designed to channel the sound of suffering directly to this room, to the safe. As he said the word safe, a low hum started in the room. It was almost too low to be heard, more a vibration felt in the teeth and bones. It emanated from the massive iron vault on the far wall. "What is that?" Maya asked, swinging her camera toward the safe. The hum was audible on the camera's microphone, a deep bass thrum. "It's responding," Ben said, his eyes wide. He was staring at the dust cloud in the center of the room. The murmuration, as he now thought of it, it was no longer drifting. Its rotation was faster, tighter. The individual motes were coalescing, forming thick, smoky tendrils within the larger mass. And from within the cloud a new sound emerged, weaving itself into the hum of the safe. Whispers. They were not distinct words. They were fragments, sibilant and sharp. The sound of 100 different voices speaking at once, all in languages none of them understood. There were soft, plaintive cries, sharp, angry clicks, and long, drawn-out moans. It was the sound of a crowd of ghosts, their voices worn thin by a century of screaming. "He did it," Julian whispered, his face ashen. He was staring at the journal, his eyes scanning the page frantically. He found a way to capture it, the resonance, the sound. It's all stored in there, in the safe. The hum from the safe grew louder, and the whispering from the murmuration intensified, rising in pitch. The dust cloud began to drift from the center of the room, moving slowly, deliberately toward Ben. He backed away, his heel hitting the leg of a chair. The cloud paused. It seemed to be watching him. "Ben," Maya said, her voice strained. "Don't move." She kept the camera on the swirling gray mass, her knuckles white on the grip. The shimmer in the corner of Ben's vision intensified. The heat haze line thickened, and for a heartbeat it took on the shape of a tall, slender man, a man holding a spear. The figure was translucent, a mirage of a man, and he was pointing, not at the cloud of dust, not at the safe. He was pointing directly at the journal in Julian's hands. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the image dissolved back into a simple distortion of light. Ben stumbled back, a gasp escaping his lips. No one else seemed to have seen it. They were all transfixed by the whispering dust. The journal lay open on the desk. The page Julian had been reading described the purpose of the collection. It was not for science or for public amusement. Creedmoor called it the choir. He had not been building a zoo. He had been building an engine fueled by pain. And by reading the journal aloud, they had just turned the key. Chapter 3: The Corral Engine. The hum from the iron vault was no longer a steady drone. It had acquired a rhythm, a slow, deep pulse like a colossal heart stirring from a long slumber. Each beat sent a sympathetic vibration through the floorboards, a tremor that felt both physical and deeply unnatural. The whispering from the murmuration responded, rising and falling in time with the pulse. The room was breathing. "Close the book," Zara ordered, her voice a sharp command that cut through the noise. "If it's responding to the words, stop reading them." Julian's hands hovered over the journal, but he hesitated. His academic curiosity warred with his instinct for self-preservation. We need to understand what this is, what he built. We understand enough, she shot back. He was a monster, and this is his monstrous house. Close it. Julian complied, shutting the leather cover with a soft thud. The effect was immediate. The whispering from the murmuration did not stop, but it lost its coherence, devolving into a directionless, static hiss. The rhythmic pulse from the safe faded back into a steady, monotonous hum. The direct connection was broken. Maya lowered her camera slightly, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her sleeve. Okay, so we don't read the book. What's plan B? There are no other doors. The window is a solid plate. We have no signal for our phones. The walls, Zara said, moving along the perimeter of the room, knocking on the wood-paneled walls. This is a stone building, but these interior panels are a later addition. There might be a gap, an old service passage maybe. Most of the wall returned a solid, dead sound. But when she reached the section behind the massive desk, her knock produced a slightly more hollow echo. Here. Together, she and Julian managed to push the heavy desk a few feet away from the wall. The wallpaper behind it, a pattern of dark damask, was undisturbed. Zara pulled a utility knife from her kit and sliced a neat square in the paper, peeling it back. Underneath was not stone, but dark, vertical planks of wood. It's a hidden door, Julian breathed. Zara examined the planks, searching for a seam or a latch. She found none. It's sealed from the other side, but the wood is old. It might be weak. She took a small, heavy pry bar from her kit and wedged it between two of the planks. She strained, the muscles in her arm cording. The wood groaned but held. "Help me." Julian joined her, and together they put their weight on the bar. There was a sharp crack of splintering wood. A sliver of absolute blackness appeared between the boards. A smell wafted out, not the dry dust of the office, but a damp, metallic odor. The smell of a slaughterhouse floor. Ben stayed by the main door, his back pressed against the cold oak. He could not take his eyes off the spot where he had seen the shimmering man. The mirage was gone, but the air in that corner felt different, colder, thinner. He felt a pull toward it, a sense of familiarity that terrified him more than the humming safe or the whispering dust. He knew that shape. He had seen it in dreams his entire life, a tall, silent figure standing on a sun-drenched plain. His ancestor. Almost there, Zara grunted, sweat beading on her forehead. With a final, violent heave, a section of the wall gave way, the planks breaking inward with a cascade of rotten wood and dust. They had created an opening, a dark, man-sized hole leading into the unknown space behind the wall. Maya immediately shone her camera light into the opening. It was not a service passage. It was a small, cramped room, no larger than a closet, an observation chamber. A single, high-backed chair stood in the center, facing a narrow slit of thick, tinted glass that looked out onto one of the zoo's enclosures below. But the room's most disturbing feature was its walls. They were covered in a complex network of copper pipes and brass funnels, all converging on a single point behind the chair. A large, horn-shaped listening device aimed at the observation slit. "My God," Julian whispered, stepping carefully through the hole. "This is it, the listening post." He ran a hand over the cold brass horn. This is how he focused the sound. Maya followed him in, her camera panning across the bizarre apparatus. It's like an old hearing aid, a giant mechanical ear. The observation slit overlooked what the park map had designated the Patagonian Highlands enclosure. It was a bleak, rocky expanse where several families of the Selknam people had been held. The journal had noted them as a particularly sonorous group, their grief a clear, bell-like tenor. As Maya's light swept across the small chamber, it illuminated something on the wall next to the chair. A series of names scratched frantically into the plaster, each with a date beside it. Below the names were tally marks, hundreds of them gouged into the wall in messy, overlapping groups. While they were distracted, Ben heard a new sound from the main office. A soft, metallic click. He turned. It came from the safe. The central combination wheel on the vault door was turning. It moved slowly, deliberately, with a series of precise clicks. One notch to the right, a pause, two notches to the left. It was not random, it was unlocking itself. "Guys," Ben called out, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Julian and Maya hurried out of the hidden chamber. Zara was already staring at the safe, her pry bar held like a weapon. They all watched, frozen, as the wheel continued its impossible, self-guided rotation. The humming intensified, the pitch rising, and within it, a new element surfaced. A single, pure musical note, sustained and unwavering, like a tuning fork struck in a cathedral. Julian stumbled back to the desk and threw open the journal, his hands shaking as he flipped through the pages. He writes about it here. He calls it the corral engine. It's not just a storage device. It's a machine. The safe is just the housing. The combination wheel stopped. A heavy, final clunk echoed from within the vault's mechanism. There was a pause of 3 seconds, a silence more terrifying than the noise. Then, with a deep groan of protesting metal, the massive iron door began to swing inward. It opened only a few inches, revealing a sliver of the profound darkness within. The pure, musical note sharpened, joined by a second, lower tone, creating a disturbing, discordant harmony. From the crack in the door, a cold, sterile wind blew out, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something vaguely biological and wrong. Julian found the passage he was looking for. He read it aloud, his voice trembling. The choir's resonance, once collected, must be focused, refined. The engine achieves this. It strips the sound of its raw emotion, leaving only the pure, generative frequency. A tone that does not merely echo reality but has the power to overwrite it. He looked up from the page, his face a mask of dawning horror. It's not a weapon that makes sound. It's a weapon made of sound, and it's turning on. The murmuration in the center of the room responded to the new tones. It surged upward, its tendrils whipping through the air. The whispers consolidated into a single, coherent, multi-voiced word, a sibilant chant that filled the room. A name. Creedmoor, Creedmoor, Creedmoor. They were not trapped in an office. They were sealed in the operational chamber of a machine designed to distill human agony into a tool for reshaping the world. Chapter 4: A Choir of Dust. The harmony emanating from the cracked open vault was physically painful. It was a dissonant chord that vibrated in the skull, making the teeth ache and vision swim at the edges. The cold wind from within the safe intensified, swirling around the room and stirring the thick dust on the furniture into dancing eddies. The murmuration, now a roiling column of gray in the center of the office, chanted its creator's name in 1,000 overlapping whispers. "We have to get out of this room," Zara yelled, her voice straining to be heard over the noise. "Now." She grabbed the heavy, high-backed chair from behind the desk. It was solid oak and incredibly heavy. "Help me." Julian, jolted from his horrified trance, joined her. Together, they lifted the chair and swung it like a battering ram against the large, sealed window. The impact produced a sickening, dull crack, but the glass did not shatter. A web of fine fractures spread from the point of impact, but the pain held. "Again," Zara commanded. They swung the chair a second time, and a third. The cracks spread, a spiderweb of brokenness that covered the entire window, but the glass refused to give way. It was impossibly thick, designed not just to be looked through, but to contain. The dissonant chord from the chorale engine shifted. A third note joined the harmony, higher and sharper than the others, a piercing tone that felt like a needle drilling into the brain. In response, the murmuration began to change. The dust cloud contracted, becoming denser, darker. It pulled itself into a more defined shape. It was no longer an abstract column. It was becoming humanoid. "It's feeding on the sound," Ben said, his back still pressed to the main door. "The energy, it's giving it a form." The shape was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its proportions subtly wrong. It had no face, just a smooth, swirling surface of dust. It took a shuffling, uncertain step away from the center of the room. It was heading for Zara. "The book," Julian said, his eyes darting between the forming creature and the journal on the desk. "Creedmoor must have written about a way to stop it, a failsafe." He scrambled to the desk, ignoring the creature, and began leafing through the journal's final pages. The handwriting there was different. It was no longer the neat, elegant script of a scholar. It was a frantic, sloping scrawl, the ink blotched and smeared. These were the words of a man losing his grip. The dust creature took another step, its movements becoming more confident. A fine shower of gray particles rained from it, landing on the Persian rug with a sound like falling sand. Zara and Maya backed away from the window, Zara holding the broken leg of the chair like a club, Maya keeping her camera on the approaching horror. "What does it say?" Maya demanded, her voice tight, but her hands surprisingly steady on her camera. "The resonance is unstable," Julian read, his voice shaky. "The choir is too dissonant. Their grief is not pure, it is polluted with rage. I sought to create a frequency of control, but I have only amplified chaos. The engine must be tuned. It requires a final, willing catalyst, a conscious mind to focus the energies, a conductor for my orchestra of pain." The dust creature was halfway across the room. It raised a long, ill-defined arm. There was no hand at the end of it, just a tapering swirl of gray matter. It pointed at Zara. The whispers coalescing around it focused on her. They were no longer chanting Creedmoor's name. They were spitting a single, venomous word. "Keeper, keeper, keeper." Ben felt a sudden, intense cold. The shimmering outline of the silent hunter materialized beside him. It was clearer than before, the image of the tall, lean warrior almost solid for a moment. The spirit did not look at the dust creature. It looked at Ben, its translucent face conveying a sense of profound urgency. It raised a phantom arm and pointed, not with accusation but with direction. It pointed to the broken opening in the wall, to the listening post. At the same time, the dust creature lunged. It didn't move with physical speed but seemed to simply close the distance in an instant, a wave of gray, whispering darkness. It did not strike Zara. It flowed over her. She screamed, a raw, terrified sound that was abruptly cut off. The murmuration enveloped her completely, a swirling vortex of dust and whispers. Her shape was visible within the cloud for a moment, thrashing before she was obscured. The cloud pulsed, a violent, convulsive motion. And the corral engine responded. The piercing three-note chord it was emitting surged in volume and intensity. A flash of pale, blue light pulsed from the crack in the safe door, illuminating the room in a ghastly glow. The engine was absorbing the energy of Zara's terror. It was feeding. The cloud of dust receded from where Zara had been standing. She was still there on her feet, but she was utterly changed. Her skin was a uniform chalky gray. Her eyes were wide, empty voids from which a slow trickle of fine dust flowed like tears. She stood perfectly still, a statue carved from ash. Then, with a soft, final sigh, her form lost its cohesion. She crumbled, collapsing into a pile of gray dust on the floor, indistinguishable from the grime that covered the century-old room. All that remained was her pry bar, which clattered loudly on the wooden floor. Maya let out a choked cry, stumbling backward and hitting the wall. Julian stared, his mouth agape, the journal slipping from his fingers and landing open on the floor. The corral engine emitted a new sound, a single, clear, resonant note of pure triumph. It had completed a part of its cycle. It had been fed. The murmuration, now smaller but somehow denser after absorbing Zara, reformed in the center of the room. It turned its featureless head, its attention shifting from the pile of dust that was Zara to the three remaining people. It was ready for its next meal. Ben understood. The hunter's gesture was not a suggestion, it was the only option. "The listening room," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Now." He broke from the door and scrambled for the opening behind the desk. Julian, shaken from his stupor, followed. Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, her camera still aimed at the dust creature, before she spun and ran after them. They tumbled through the jagged opening into the cramped, dark chamber behind the wall, just as the dust creature began to drift across the office floor toward them. Chapter 5: The Conductor's Chair. They fell into the listening post, a tangle of limbs and panicked breaths. Ben slammed his shoulder against the splintered planks, trying to wedge the broken section of wall back into the opening. The wood was too rotten. It offered no security. He could see the dust creature through the cracks, a formless gray shadow gliding silently across the main office toward them. "It won't hold," Maya said, her voice a ragged whisper. She was pressed against the far wall, her camera still clutched in her hands, though the lens was now aimed at the floor. The professional facade was gone, replaced by raw, animal fear. Julian was on his hands and knees, hyperventilating. "A catalyst," he gasped, pushing his hair back from his forehead. "A willing mind. Creedmoor. He was going to sit in that chair. He was going to absorb the power himself." He pointed a trembling finger at the high-backed leather chair that stood in the center of the tiny chamber. The chair faced the narrow observation slit, its worn leather cracked and faded. In front of it, the bizarre collection of copper pipes and brass horns, the mechanical ear, all converged on a single point just behind the headrest. This was not just a listening post. It was a throne, a focusing array. The whispers from the main office grew louder, pressing in on them. They seeped through the cracks in the broken wall. They no longer chanted. They spoke in full, overlapping sentences, voices of 100 dead souls telling the stories of their stolen lives, their miserable deaths. The air in the small chamber grew thick with their sorrow. From the office, the corral engine began a new phase. The single, triumphant note fractured into a complex, multi-layered sequence. It was a melody of sorts, but a chilling, alien one, constructed from tones that scraped at the edges of human hearing. It was the sound of mathematics, the sound of a world being unwritten. A gray, smoky tendril snaked through a gap in the broken wall. It was a probe from the murmuration. It twisted in the air, testing the environment before retreating. The creature was right outside. "It's trapping us," Maya breathed. "It's cornering us in here." Ben looked at the chair, then at the observation slit, then back at the pointing, spectral image of the silent hunter that was seared into his memory. He finally understood. The spirit wasn't showing him an escape route. It was showing him his purpose, his inheritance. The zoo had taken his ancestor's life, added his misery to its infernal choir. That connection, that bloodline was a key. Creedmoor needed a willing mind, Ben said, his own voice sounding distant to him. Someone to sit in the chair and direct the energy. He wanted to control it. But the journal said the resonance was polluted with rage, Julian countered, looking up from the floor. He couldn't control it. No one could. He couldn't, Ben agreed, his gaze fixed on the chair. He was the zookeeper, the source of the pain. The choir would have torn him apart. He took a step toward the chair. But what if the conductor wasn't their captor? What if he was one of them? Maya and Julian stared at him. "Ben, no," Maya said, taking a step forward. "What are you talking about? You can't." "My great-great-grandfather died in that enclosure," Ben said, gesturing toward the observation slit. "The one this room looks out on. I can hear him in the whispers. His voice is one of them." He was no longer afraid. A strange, cold calm had settled over him. He was not an intruder here. He was home. The murmuration slammed against the makeshift barrier, its full weight striking the broken planks. Wood splintered. Dust poured into the small room, carrying the stench of the grave. The creature was forcing its way in. Ben walked to the chair. He placed a hand on its cold, cracked leather back. When he touched it, a jolt went up his arm, a current of static electricity that carried with it a flood of images and sounds. He saw the face of Augustus Creedmoor, his eyes alight with a fanatic's fire. He heard the first notes from the engine, the first test. He felt the wave of raw, psychic agony that had washed through this room a century ago. "Ben, get away from there," Julian shouted. But Ben didn't listen. He walked around the chair and sat down. The moment he was seated, the world dissolved. The copper and brass apparatus behind his head hummed to life. The whispers from the murmuration flooded his mind, not as a chaotic mess, but as individual, distinct voices. He knew their names: Anka, Lena, Kosa. He felt their loneliness, their sickness, their burning, bottomless rage. He was drowning in a sea of stolen souls. Through the observation slit, the bleak, rocky enclosure outside was no longer empty. It was filled with them. The translucent, shimmering forms of the captives, hundreds of them, all standing and looking up, not at the window but directly at him. Among them in the front stood the tall, slender warrior with the spear, the silent hunter, his ancestor. He was not pointing anymore. He was nodding, a gesture of grim acceptance. The complex melody from the corral engine surged, flowing through the apparatus and into Ben's mind. It was a torrent of pure, weaponized sound. But filtered through the choir of his ancestors, it was not just a weapon. It was a tool. He felt the rage, the chaos Julian had read about, but underneath it he felt a single, unifying desire that bound all the spirits together, the desire for silence, for peace. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out was not his own. It was a chorus of hundreds, a powerful, resonant sound that was part Ben's voice and part the ghosts of the zoo. He spoke a single word. Enough. In the main office, the grinding door of the safe suddenly slammed shut with the force of a cannon shot. The multi-layered melody from the corral engine stopped instantly, cut off in the middle of a note. The murmuration, which had been pouring through the broken wall, recoiled as if struck. The whispers ceased. A profound, absolute silence fell over the room. Julian and Maya stared speechless into the main office. The dusk creature was gone, having dissolved back into the inert, drifting motes that filled the air. The threat had vanished. But in the listening post, the ordeal was not over. Ben sat rigid in the chair, his eyes wide and unseeing, a single tear of blood tracing a path from his left eye down his cheek. He had become the conductor. He had silenced the orchestra, but now he was bound to it, the living nexus for a century of pain. The door to the cage was closed, but he was now the lock. He was trapped, not in a room, but in a symphony of silent screams. The zoo had finally claimed a new exhibit. Chapter 6: The Quality of Silence. The silence that followed was not a relief. It was a vacuum. Every sound that had filled the office, the multi-layered drone of the engine, the thousand-voiced whispers of the murmuration, the very hum of ambient dread was gone, and its absence left a ringing void. The air felt thin, stripped of pressure. Julian and Maya stood in the jagged opening to the listening post, staring into the main office. The dust motes, which had moments before formed a thinking, killing entity, now drifted in the dim light with mundane aimlessness. The pile of fine gray powder that used to be Zara lay undisturbed on the rug. Maya was the first to move. She stepped cautiously from the listening post back into the office, her boots making no sound on the thick carpet. She walked over to the pile of dust, her camera held low at her side, its red light still blinking, a single, stupidly optimistic eye in the gloom. She reached out a hand, then stopped, her fingers trembling a few inches from the gray mound. There was nothing to touch, nothing to confirm. She's gone, Maya said. The words were flat, hollowed out. It just erased her. Julian followed her out, his gaze fixed on the man who had done the erasing. Ben sat bolt upright in the conductor's chair, a statue of flesh and blood. His eyes were open, fixed on the narrow observation slit, but they saw nothing. The single track of dried blood on his cheek was a stark, dark line against his pale skin. His hands gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. He did not seem to be breathing. Julian approached him slowly. Ben, he waved a hand in front of Ben's face. There was no reaction. He put his fingers to Ben's neck. He let out a sharp, surprised breath. He has a pulse. It's slow, but it's there. It's steady. Ben was alive, but he was not with them. He was a prisoner in his own body, the living lock on a cage of shrieking souls. Julian looked at the complex array of brass horns and copper wires behind the chair, all aimed at the back of Ben's skull. He was plugged into the misery of this place, a human buffer between the world and whatever Creedmoor's engine had been on the verge of becoming. "We can't leave him here," Maya stated, turning away from Zara's remains. Her voice had a new edge to it, brittle and sharp. The filmmaker was gone. The survivor was in her place. "We have to get him out of that chair." She moved to Ben's side and tried to lift him. It was like trying to move a statue bolted to the floor. Ben's body was rigid, his muscles locked with an unnatural tension. His grip on the chair was unbreakable. "He's not just sitting in it," Julian said, his mind piecing it together with a cold, academic horror. "He's connected to it, integrated. The journal, Creedmoor called the conductor a catalyst. Ben completed the circuit. If we force him out, what happens? Does the engine restart? Does that thing come back?" He gestured toward the settled dust in the center of the room. The dilemma hung in the air between them. To save Ben might be to doom themselves. To leave him was unthinkable. They were trapped by a problem with no safe answer. The silence began to work on them. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of their own clothing was magnified. They found themselves listening for the whispers, for the hum, anticipating the return of the chaos. The quiet was a threat, a held breath before a scream. "The journal," Julian said suddenly, his eyes falling on the book lying open on the office floor. "There has to be more, a release, a way to disconnect him." He walked to the desk, his steps hesitant. He felt as if he were disturbing a tomb. He bent down and picked up the heavy volume. As he lifted it, the pages, loosened from their binding by his earlier frantic search, fell open toward the very back. He saw something he had missed before. Tucked into a leather sleeve on the inside back cover was a sheaf of folded papers, written on with the same spidery script, but with a different kind of ink, darker and fresher. A final addendum. An epilogue to the madness. Julian unfolded the first page. The title at the top was not written in Creedmoor's elegant cursive. It was a crude, angry block of letters gouged into the paper. It read, "Contingency." "What is it?" Maya asked, coming to stand beside him. "The choir may prove untamable," Julian read, his voice low. "A rogue conductor, an impurity in the resonance. Such an eventuality must be planned for. The great work cannot be permitted to fail. Should the engine fall silent by any hand other than my own, a fail-safe protocol will be initiated. The grounds must be sterilized of the anomaly." Julian looked up from the page, his eyes wide. It's not over. Shutting down the engine was just a trigger for something else. He scanned the next few lines, his face growing paler. What, Maya pressed? A trigger for what? He writes about a guardian, Julian said, his voice barely audible. A final line of defense, not a spirit, not a sound, something physical. He made something, or he summoned it. He calls it the curator. Its purpose is to archive specimens and correct errors. Zara. It would have considered her a specimen. But Ben. Julian looked over at the catatonic man in the chair. Ben is the error it needs to correct. As the last word left his lips, a sound came from outside the office. It was not the wind. It was not a spiritual manifestation. It was the heavy, rhythmic scrape of something solid and heavy being dragged across the stone pathways of the zoo. It was methodical. It was relentless. And it was getting closer. Chapter 7. A Failsafe of Flesh. The scraping sound was an assault on the unnatural silence. It was a patient, grinding noise that spoke of immense weight and tireless effort. Julian and Maya stood frozen, listening as it grew steadily louder, moving up the main path toward the founder's office. Whatever was making the sound, it was not trying to be stealthy. It was announcing its approach. The curator, Maya whispered, backing away from the door and toward the relative perceived safety of the listening post. Julian's hands tightened on the addendum pages. Creedmoor writes that it is bound to the grounds. It cannot leave. Its prime directive is the preservation of the acoustic integrity of the park. He scanned the text frantically. It's a biological construct. He built it from parts of captives who were unfit for display. He calls it a failsafe of flesh. The scraping stopped directly outside the main office door. The silence that followed was worse than the noise had been. They stared at the thick oak door, expecting it to splinter, to be torn from its hinges. Nothing happened. A minute passed. 2. The only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. "What is it doing?" Maya asked, her voice a strained hiss. "Archiving," Julian breathed, remembering the journal's text. "It's cataloging, assessing the situation." From behind them in the conductor's chair, Ben made a sound. It was a low, guttural moan, the noise of a man in the grip of an unbearable nightmare. His head twitched, a short, violent jerk to the side. A second line of blood, bright and fresh, welled from the corner of his right eye and traced a path parallel to the first. He was fighting, somewhere deep inside himself, against the ocean of pain he was holding back. "He can feel it," Julian said. "He's connected to this whole place. He knows it's here." Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the office. It wasn't the door. It was the window. The massive, thick-paned window they had failed to break with the chair. A new web of cracks appeared on its surface, centered on a point near the top. A deep, percussive impact, as if something had struck it from the outside with a sledgehammer. Crash. The sound came again, louder this time. The glass fractured further, pieces of it falling onto the rug inside. The curator hadn't been trying to get through the door. It had been scaling the stone walls of the building. Maya instinctively raised her camera, the lens aimed at the window. "It's coming in." Crack. A third impact. A shape appeared in the growing hole, something pale and wrapped in dark leather. A fist. It was a massive, impossibly large fist, made not of skin, but of a patchwork of materials stitched together. It withdrew. Then, with a final, explosive shatter, the entire top half of the window gave way. A shower of thick, razor-sharp glass rained down into the office. A figure began to pull itself through the opening. It was worse than anything Julian's imagination could have conjured from the journal's text. It was humanoid only in its basic shape. It stood over 7 feet tall, a grotesque collection of mismatched human parts bound together with thick, waxed thread and leather straps. Its skin was a mosaic of different tones and textures, stretched taut over a frame that was clearly not a single skeleton. One arm was long and powerfully muscled, the other thin and wiry. It had no face, only a smooth, tan sheet of hide where features should be, with a series of vertical slits that pulsed open and closed, emitting a low, wet, clicking sound. It was an abomination of taxidermy and surgery. This was Creedmoor's curator. It pulled its heavy, misshapen body through the shattered window and dropped to the office floor with a heavy, wet thud. It took a moment to orient itself, its faceless head swiveling, the slits opening and closing rapidly. It ignored Julian and Maya completely, as if they were nothing more than furniture. Its attention was focused on one thing, the pile of gray dust on the floor. With a slow, dragging gait, the curator moved to where Zara had fallen. From a leather pouch on its hip, it produced a large, antique glass specimen jar. It knelt down, a parody of reverence, and with one of its mismatched hands it began to scoop the dust into the jar. It was meticulous, careful not to leave a single particle behind. It was archiving its first specimen. While the creature was preoccupied, Maya grabbed Julian's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. "The window," she whispered urgently. "It's our only way. We have to go now." Julian looked from the window to Ben, still rigid in the chair. "We can't carry him. He's dead weight. We'd never make it." "Then we have to try and wake him up," Maya insisted. But as she spoke, the curator finished its task. It sealed the jar with a heavy cork stopper and placed it carefully back in its pouch. Its work was done. It rose to its full, towering height, and then it turned, its faceless head fixing on the opening to the listening post. It had archived the specimen. Now it was time to correct the error. It took a step toward them, its heavy, uneven footfalls shaking the floor. Ben moaned again, a long, agonized sound. The battle inside his mind was intensifying. He was their shield, but he was also the monster's target. Julian and Maya were trapped between a creature of flesh and a man who had become a vessel for ghosts, with their only escape route guarded by the very thing they needed to flee. Chapter 8: The Anomaly. The curator advanced into the listening post, its bulk filling the cramped space. It moved with a dreadful, unhurried purpose, the wet clicking from its facial slits growing faster, more excited. It was a sound of biological machinery preparing to perform its function. The creature's stitched-together form smelled of formaldehyde and old leather, a chemically sterile scent that failed to mask the underlying odor of rot. Julian shoved Maya behind him, instinctively placing himself between her and the monster. He grabbed the only thing he could reach, a heavy, brass-bound book from a small shelf next to the chair. It was a useless weapon, but his hands needed something to hold. "Get away from him," Julian shouted, his voice cracking. The curator did not react to the sound. Its attention was fixed entirely on Ben, the anomaly in the chair. It saw him as a flaw in the system, a broken component in Creedmoor's great machine. It raised its larger, more muscular arm, the one terminating in a hand of mismatched thick fingers. It was reaching for Ben's head. Its function was clear: to decommission the faulty conductor. Just as its fingers were about to touch Ben's hair, a violent tremor shook the small room. It wasn't an earthquake. The vibration came from the chair itself. Ben's body was convulsing, a series of violent, full-body spasms. He let out a raw, wordless scream that was not entirely his own voice. It was layered, a chorus of agony and fury, the voices of the choir. The brass and copper apparatus behind his head glowed with a faint blue light, the same corona that had pulsed from the safe. Ben was not just a passive shield. He was channeling the spirit's rage. A wave of invisible force erupted from him. The curator was thrown backward, stumbling out of the listening post and into the main office as if struck by a physical blow. It landed heavily on the rug, its limbs flailing. The specimen jar containing Zara's dust fell from its pouch and rolled under the desk. The room's temperature plummeted. A visible frost spread from the conductor's chair, crawling across the floor and up the walls. The air grew thick with a palpable malevolence. The spirits were fighting back, using Ben as their anchor in the physical world. The curator pushed itself back to its feet, its faceless head tilting with what might have been confusion. Its programming was simple: correct the error. It had not accounted for the error fighting back. It let out a low, gurgling hiss and charged back toward the opening. "The window," Maya screamed, finally breaking free of her paralysis. "Julian, we have to move him. It's our only chance." Julian looked at Ben. The convulsions had stopped, but his skin was now shockingly pale, and the frost from the floor was creeping up his legs. He was burning himself out, a conduit being overloaded with spectral energy. They had to get him out of the chair, out of the building. The curator was almost upon them again. Acting on pure adrenaline, Maya grabbed the one thing of substance she had, her professional-grade camera. It was a heavy, solid piece of equipment. She swung it with all her might, bringing it down on the creature's advancing arm. There was a sickening, wet crunch. The camera's lens shattered, but the impact had an effect. The curator's arm buckled, and several of the wax threads holding it together snapped. The arm hung at a grotesque angle. The creature let out a high-pitched shriek, a sound of grinding metal and tearing flesh, and swatted Maya aside. She flew across the room, hitting the bookshelves and collapsing to the floor in a heap. Seeing Maya fall, Julian roared with a fury he didn't know he possessed. He lunged forward, not at the creature, but at the conductor's chair. He grabbed Ben under the arms. "Ben, listen to me. You have to let go. Let go of the chair." He pulled with all his strength. This time there was a give. Ben's fingers, locked in a death grip, loosened slightly. The connection was weakening. The curator, ignoring the injured Maya, turned its full attention to Julian. It was done trying to be precise. It raised its good arm to deliver a fatal blow. At that moment, Ben's eyes focused. For one single, lucid second, they were not empty voids. They were his eyes. He looked at Julian. His lips moved, forming a single, rasping word. Run. Then his body went limp. The spectral energy vanished. The frost on the floor receded. The connection was broken. Ben slumped forward, a dead weight in Julian's arms. He had severed himself from the choir to save them. The curator's blow, meant for Julian, now came down on the empty headrest of the conductor's chair. The old wood exploded into a spray of splinters. Freed from the machine, Julian stumbled back, dragging Ben's unconscious body with him. The curator, its primary target now mobile, turned its faceless head toward them, its clicking growing frantic and enraged. "Maya!" Julian shouted. She stirred on the floor, groaning, a dark bruise already forming on her temple. She pushed herself up, her gaze locking onto the only path available, the shattered window. They had a choice, and it had to be made in a heartbeat. The curator was between them and the main door. The only way out was through the broken glass, into the cold, dead grounds of the zoo. Dragging an unconscious man through that opening while being hunted by a monster made of corpses seemed impossible. Leaving him behind was not an option. Julian began to drag Ben toward the window. "Maya, help me." The curator straightened up, its function reasserting itself. It began to move, blocking their path to the window. Its mission was absolute. The anomaly had to be purged. Chapter 9: The Curator's Hunt. The curator, cheated of its purpose, refocused. The anomaly was no longer in the chair. It was in the arms of the other man. The creature's programming, stripped of its primary objective's location, defaulted to a simpler, more brutal logic: destroy the error and destroy any who protect it. It straightened to its full, grotesque height, its good arm flexing, the mismatched fingers curling into a fist. "Julian, it's coming," Maya yelled, scrambling to her feet. A dark bruise was already purpling on her temple, and she swayed, gripping a bookshelf for support. Julian hauled Ben's limp body backward, his heels digging into the thick rug. Ben was an anchor, a lead weight of unconsciousness. Every foot of ground was a monumental effort. The shattered window was 10 feet away, an impossible distance. The curator took a ponderous step, then another, its heavy footfalls shaking the floor. It was closing the distance, its path clear. "The bookshelf," Julian grunted, his voice strained with the effort of dragging Ben. "Maya, push it." Maya looked at the towering shelf beside her, laden with hundreds of heavy, leather-bound volumes. It was immense, but desperation was a powerful lever. She put her shoulder to its side and pushed. The old wood groaned. For a moment, nothing happened. The curator was only a few feet from Julian now, its strange, clicking face slits focused on him. Maya screamed, a raw sound of fury and terror, and threw her entire body weight into the push. The bookshelf tilted. It hung for a heart-stopping second, a monolith of paper and wood defying gravity. Then it crashed down with a deafening roar. Books, dust, and splintered wood exploded across the floor, creating a chaotic barrier directly in the curator's path. The creature was forced to halt, its path blocked. It let out its metallic, grinding shriek of frustration and began to claw at the wreckage, tossing heavy volumes aside with contemptuous ease. But it had given them the time they needed. Julian reached the window. He laid Ben on the floor amidst the shards of glass. "The curtains. We need a rope." Maya, breathing heavily, staggered over to the window and tore at the thick, velvet drapes. The fabric was a century old and rotten. It ripped away from its brass rings with a sound like tearing paper. Together, they knotted one end around the base of a heavy, bolted-down radiator next to the window frame. The makeshift rope of crimson velvet tumbled down the stone wall outside, reaching almost to the ground below. "Ben first," Julian decided. "I'll lower him. You guide him down so he doesn't swing into the wall." Maya, her head pounding, nodded and carefully climbed through the broken window, her boots crunching on the remaining glass. She stood on the narrow stone ledge, the wind cold against her face, and grabbed the velvet rope. Julian wrestled Ben's body through the opening. The unconscious man was impossibly heavy. Julian wrapped the velvet around his own wrists for grip and began to slowly, painstakingly lower him. The fabric groaned under the weight. Dust and dry-rotted fibers rained down. From behind them, a loud crash signaled that the curator had cleared the bookshelf. Its heavy footsteps resumed. "Julian, hurry," Maya urged, her voice tight with panic. Ben's feet touched the ground. Julian let the velvet slip through his raw hands, and Ben collapsed in a heap on the damp soil below. "You next," Julian said to Maya. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the rope and half climbed, half slid down, landing unsteadily next to Ben. She looked up. Julian was starting to climb through the window just as the curator's monstrous form appeared behind him. The creature reached for him, its stitched fingers grasping. Julian threw himself out of the window, not bothering with the rope. He fell the last 10 feet, landing hard, a sharp pain shooting up his ankle. He looked up. The curator stood in the shattered window frame, a dark, hulking silhouette against the gloom of the office. It looked down at them, its faceless head tilting. It did not seem angered by their escape. Its programming was absolute. The anomaly was on the grounds. Therefore, the hunt would continue on the grounds. With a horrifying lack of hesitation, the creature simply stepped out of the window. It fell, its heavy body making no attempt to break its fall. It hit the ground with a sickening, wet impact that should have shattered every bone in a human body. For a moment, it lay still. Then, with a series of jerks and cracks, it pushed itself back onto its feet. One of its legs now bent at an unnatural angle, but it was functional. It turned its head toward them and began to walk, dragging its damaged leg behind it. The sound was no longer a simple scrape. It was a rhythmic, dragging grind of broken bone and determined purpose. The hunt had begun. Chapter 10: The Hunting Grounds. The zoo at night was a different beast. Under the thin, watery light of a clouded-over moon, the enclosures were cages of shadow, and the exotic, overgrown trees took on monstrous shapes. The air was cold and damp, clinging to them as Julian and Maya hauled Ben's dead weight away from the founder's office. "This way," Julian gasped, his ankle screaming with every step. "The service path. It leads toward the main gate." They moved through a labyrinth of wrought iron and crumbling concrete. Maya's head throbbed in time with their frantic footsteps. Every rustle in the undergrowth, Every gust of wind that rattled a loose cage door sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her. Behind them, the dreadful, rhythmic grind of the curator's pursuit was a constant, patient threat. It wasn't fast, but it was tireless. They ducked behind the crumbling facade of the Oriental Bazaar, a series of alcoves where artisans from annexed territories had once been forced to perform their crafts for gawking crowds. They pressed themselves into the shadows, their chests heaving. "We can't keep this up," Maya breathed, leaning against the cold stone. "He's too heavy, my head. The whole world is spinning." "I know," Julian said, looking back the way they had come. The scraping was closer now. "We need a place to hide, somewhere it can't get in." He scanned the area. His eyes settled on a low, domed building nearby, its iron-barred windows promising some measure of security. The sign above the door, barely legible, read Arctic Exhibit. There. They half-dragged, half-carried Ben to the exhibit's main door. It was a heavy iron affair, secured by a thick, rusted chain. Julian grabbed a loose rock and smashed it against the ancient padlock. On the third strike, the corroded metal shattered. The door groaned open into a cavern of artificial cold. They stumbled inside, into what was once a refrigerated diorama of the Arctic. The cooling systems had failed decades ago, but a deep, permanent chill clung to the place. The walls were painted with fatting murals of ice floes and aurora-lit skis. In the center of the room, a series of plaster icebergs sat in a dry, concrete pool. It was here that Anka, the Inuit shaman, had been displayed. The air was heavy with her sorrow. Julian and Maya managed to wedge the heavy door shut, bracing it with a fallen piece of plaster that looked like a small glacier. It wouldn't hold the curator for long, but it would buy them time. They laid Ben down in the shadow of a plaster iceberg. "How's your head?" Julian asked Maya, his voice low. She touched the bruise on her temple and winced. "Like I got hit by a monster made of dead people. It'll pass." She looked at Ben's still form. "What about him? Is he ever going to wake up?" As if in answer, Ben stirred. His eyes remained closed, but he mumbled, his voice thick and slurred, a man talking in a deep, troubled sleep. It wasn't nonsense. It was names. "Anka," he whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the cold, empty room. "Lena, Kosa." Julian and Maya exchanged a look of pure dread. He was still connected to them. He was a beacon. "He's dreaming their dreams," Julian said, a horrified understanding dawning. "He's not just a lock anymore. He's a library." Outside, the grinding drag stopped. The silence that descended was absolute. They held their breath, listening. A soft, scratching sound came from the iron door. Then a series of slow, deliberate taps, as if the creature were testing the door's strength. It knew they were inside. Ben mumbled again, louder this time. "She's cold, always so cold. She carves the ice. She carves a man with no face." Julian's blood ran cold. He looked around the exhibit. On the plaster wall behind Ben, almost invisible in the dim light, was a series of carvings etched into the plaster itself. They were intricate, depicting scenes from the zoo. The final carving, clearly made with a different, sharper tool, showed a tall, hulking figure with a smooth, featureless face, standing over three smaller, broken figures. Anka had prophesied her avenger. A tremendous boom shook the entire building as the curator threw its full weight against the iron door. The metal shrieked in protest. The plaster brace cracked. Boom! The door buckled inward, its hinges screaming. The curator was not a subtle hunter. It was a demolition machine. Julian looked around frantically for another exit, another way out. There was none. They were in a sealed box. The only way out was the way they had come in. Ben shivered on the cold concrete floor, lost in his nightmare of ghosts, while outside, a monster of flesh hammered its way in to grant him a final, dreamless sleep. Chapter 11. The Song of the Unseen. The iron door of the Arctic exhibit held for 3 more impacts, each one a deafening cannonade that sent dust and chips of plaster raining from the ceiling. On the 4th strike, the hinges tore from the stone frame with a scream of tortured metal. The door fell inward, crashing to the concrete floor with a deafening clang that echoed through the cold chamber. The curator stood in the ruined doorway, a silhouette against the pale moonlight. It paused, its faceless head swiveling as it scanned the interior of the exhibit. Its gaze passed over Julian and Maya, dismissing them as irrelevant, and locked onto the shivering form of Ben lying on the floor. The anomaly. Julian grabbed the only weapon available, the heavy iron chain that had once secured the door. It was pitiful, but it was something. Maya, get behind me. Maya, however, wasn't looking at the curator. Her eyes were wide, fixed on a point just behind the creature. Julian, she whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of fear. It's not alone. Julian followed her gaze. In the darkness of the zoo grounds behind the curator, figures were gathering. They were translucent, shimmering shapes, barely visible against the overgrown foliage. The faint, ghostly afterimages of the Victorian tourists. They stood in a silent, semicircular crowd, their hollow eyes all fixed on the drama about to unfold in the exhibit. They were not participants. They were an audience drawn to the spectacle of suffering. The curator, oblivious to its spectral gallery, took a dragging step into the room. As its foot crossed the threshold, the temperature in the exhibit, already cold, dropped to a painful, biting degree. A fine layer of real frost instantly bloomed on the floor around Ben's body, spreading outward in a perfect circle. Ben cried out in his sleep, a sharp, terrified yelp. The ice is watching. The curator halted. The sudden drop in temperature, the frost, the shout from its target, this was unexpected data. It tilted its head, its facial slits pulsing as it processed the new variables. This hesitation was the only chance they would get. Julian swung the heavy chain, aiming for the creature's damaged leg. The chain wrapped around its ankle with a heavy clank. Julian pulled, throwing all his weight into the effort. The curator, already off balance, stumbled, its good leg struggling to compensate. It let out a frustrated, gurgling hiss. "The pool," Maya shouted, pointing to the dry, concrete basin in the center of the room that was meant to simulate the Arctic Sea. "Get it in the pool." While the curator was distracted, trying to untangle the chain from its leg, Maya scrambled to her feet. She ran to one of the larger plaster icebergs at the edge of the pool. It was a hollow construct, but it was huge and anchored to the floor. Using the last of her strength, she pushed against its highest point. It resisted, Then, with a groan of stressed plaster, it began to tilt. The curator finally ripped the chain from its leg and turned its attention back to Julian, raising its fist. But it was too late. The massive plaster iceberg toppled over, crashing down into the concrete pool with a sound like a building collapsing. It shattered into 1,000 pieces, sending up a cloud of white dust. It didn't strike the curator, but it landed directly in its path, creating a new, treacherous obstacle of broken, jagged plaster. The creature, its simple programming driving it forward, did not try to go around. It stepped onto the unstable pile of wreckage. Its damaged leg found no purchase on a sharp, angled piece of plaster. The joint, already weakened, snapped with a wet, audible crack. The curator crashed down into the basin, its body twisted at an unnatural angle, its leg now completely useless. It was trapped, but it was not helpless. It lay on its back in the pit of broken plaster and began to pull itself forward with its one good arm, dragging its useless lower body behind it. It was still coming for Ben. Julian and Maya stared down at it, panting. They had crippled it, but they hadn't stopped it. From outside, a new sound began, weaving itself into the night. It wasn't the tourists and it wasn't the curator. It was a sound that didn't seem to come from any single direction but from the very air itself. It was a soft, mournful song, a humming melody without words, sung in a clear female voice. It was a lament filled with a deep, bottomless sorrow. Ben stopped shivering. He grew still. In his sleep, a single tear rolled from his closed eye. "Anka," he whispered. "She's singing." The ghost of the Inuit shaman, bound to her frozen prison, was making her presence known. The song grew in volume, its sorrow so profound it felt like a physical pressure. The curator paused in its relentless crawl. It lifted its faceless head, swiveling it back and forth as if trying to locate the source of the sound that its programming could not comprehend. The song was a distraction, a gift. "Now," Julian said, his voice low and urgent, "while it's confused, we get Ben and we run for the main gate. It's our last chance." They scrambled down into the pit. As they reached Ben, his eyes fluttered open. They were lucid. He was awake. He looked up at Julian, then at the struggling form of the curator just a few feet away. "I heard her," he said, his voice weak but clear. "She's holding them back, the others." He wasn't talking about the curator. He was talking about the angrier, more violent spirits. Anka's song was a lullaby for the dead, a blanket of sorrow that was momentarily pacifying the rage of the zoo. They helped him to his feet. He was weak, unsteady, but he could walk. The three of them climbed out of the other side of the basin, leaving the crippled curator still trying to make sense of the ghostly music. They stumbled out of the Arctic exhibit, back into the night, the mournful, beautiful song of the unseen shaman following them as they ran. Chapter 12. The Iron Lullaby. Anka's song was a shield of sorrow. The mournful, wordless melody wrapped around them, a buffer against the raw malevolence of the park. It did not make them feel safe. The sound was too full of grief for that, but it felt like a protection, a sacred space carved out of the oppressive dark. Behind them there was no sound of pursuit. The curator, a creature of pure physical purpose, was baffled by the spectral music. The other, angrier spirits seemed pacified, held in check by the sheer weight of Anka's lament. They half ran, half stumbled along the main promenade, the wide, cobbled path that led from the founder's office to the main gate. Ben, though on his feet, was a heavy burden, leaning on Julian's shoulder. His brief connection to the choir had left him hollowed out, his physical strength sapped. "The gate," Ben managed, his voice a dry rasp. "They're angriest there. It's the one place they could never pass." The main gate came into view, a grand, Gothic arch of wrought iron flanked by two stone pillars. It was a monument to Creedmoor's ego, promising wonders within and guaranteeing no escape. It was their only hope. As they drew closer, the protective quality of Anka's song began to thin. The melody wavered, strained by the sheer concentration of spiritual rage that festered at the park's border. They could feel it, a psychic wall of pure resentment. They reached the gate, a colossal, rust-pitted chain, each link as thick as a man's wrist, was wrapped around the bars, secured by a lock the size of a dinner plate. "Stand back," Julian said, grabbing the same rock he had used on the Arctic exhibit's padlock. It seemed a foolish, desperate hope, but it was the only one they had. He swung the rock against the lock. The impact produced a dull, unsatisfying clang. The lock was unscratched. He swung again and again, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The lock was solid iron, a brute of a thing. "It's not just the lock," Ben said, his hand pressed against the cold iron bars of the gate. His eyes were closed. "They're holding it, their anger. It's like mortar in the mechanism. They don't want us to leave. They don't want anyone to ever leave again." Maya ran her hands over the gate, pushing against the bars. It was like trying to move a mountain. Ben was right. The resistance felt more than physical. It felt absolute, a conceptual refusal to open. From the top of the hill, from the direction of the Arctic exhibit, Anka's song faltered. The clear, steady melody broke, dissolving into a series of pained, fragmented notes. Then it stopped. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was terrifying. It was not the empty silence from the office. It was a hungry, waiting silence. The lullaby had ended. The monsters were waking up. And then they heard it. From far up the path, the sound resumed. The slow, patient, rhythmic grind of the curator's broken body dragging itself toward them. It had recovered from its confusion. Its hunt was back on. "It's not working," Julian yelled, striking the lock one last time, the rock cracking in his hand. He dropped the useless pieces. "It's not going to open." They were trapped. The gate was an impassable wall of iron and spite in front of them. The tireless, mangled creature of flesh was behind them. The spectral audience was watching from the shadows. The brief hope Anka's song had given them was gone, leaving only the cold, hard reality of their cage. The zoo was not done with them yet. Chapter 13. The Echo Garden. The grinding scrape grew closer, a death knell on stone. There was no time to think, only to react. "This way," Maya shouted, pointing to a narrow, overgrown path that branched off the main promenade. "It's the only other path." There was no choice. Julian put Ben's arm over his shoulder and the three of them plunged into the foliage, leaving the impassable main gate behind. The path was tight, thorny branches tearing at their clothes. It led them into a sunken, bowl-shaped area of the park that Julian recognized from Creedmoor's maps, the botanical collection, a place where plants from every corner of the empire had been brought to grow. The Echo Garden. The air here was different, humid, thick, and cloyingly sweet with the scent of a dozen alien blossoms. Giant, waxy leaves drooped over the path, creating a suffocating green tunnel. The sounds of their own frantic passage were strangely muffled, swallowed by the dense vegetation. And then they began to hear the other sounds. A soft, weeping sound came from a thicket of pale, bell-shaped flowers to their left. It was the cry of a young child. "Don't stop," Julian commanded, his voice a harsh whisper though his eyes darted toward the sound. "It's not real." They pushed deeper into the garden. A man's voice, sharp and angry, shouted in a language none of them recognized, the sound seeming to come from the rustling leaves of a broad, fan-like palm. A moment later, a woman's laugh, light and musical, echoed from a patch of dark, orchid-like flowers. "The journal," Julian gasped, remembering a short, cryptic entry. He wrote that some of the flora here were exceptional mimics. He thought it was a simple biological curiosity. "It's not just mimicking," Ben said, his head turning back and forth, his eyes wide with distress. "It's replaying the plants. They absorb the sounds, the emotions. They're like organic phonographs stuck on a loop." The garden was a living museum of sound, a library of every shout, cry, and whisper of despair its captives had ever uttered. It was a chaotic, disorienting symphony of misery that pressed in on them from all sides. A voice cut through the cacophony, sharp and clear and chillingly familiar. "The mechanism is destroyed. We are locked inside this room." Maya froze, her blood turning to ice. The voice was Zara's. It was a perfect, crystal-clear reproduction, and it came from a dense, thorny vine that snaked around a nearby tree trunk. The vine pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent light. "Maya, no," Julian said, grabbing her arm. "It's just a memory, a sound." But the vine wasn't done. "He was a monster," Zara's voice continued, cold and angry. Then a new sound was added, a raw, terrified scream abruptly cut off. Zara's final moment. A choked sob escaped Maya's lips. It was a cruel, psychological blow. The garden had found her deepest, freshest wound and was probing it with clinical precision. She stumbled away from Julian, pressing her hands over her ears. "Make it stop." The distraction was what the curator had been waiting for. It had not followed them down the main path. It had taken a more direct route, crashing through the foliage at the rim of the sunken garden. It now stood at the edge of the clearing, its broken leg dragging uselessly, its faceless head turning as it pinpointed their location amidst the cacophony of phantom voices. It had found them. The garden's confusing sounds were no impediment to a creature that likely did not hunt by hearing. Separated by the psychological assault of the garden, with Maya nearly catatonic with grief and Julian struggling to support Ben, they were cornered. The curator began to drag itself down the slope into the garden, its one good arm pulling its mangled body forward, its clicking slits a steady, predatory rhythm against the chaotic chorus of the dead. Chapter 14. A Pound of Flesh. The curator slid down the muddy embankment into the garden, its good arm clawing at the earth for purchase. It landed with a heavy squelch, its attention immediately locking onto Ben, the anomaly it was programmed to destroy. The cacophony of the echo garden meant nothing to it. The creature was a physical solution to a metaphysical problem. Maya, seeing the monster's approach, was jolted from her grief-stricken trance. The image of Zara's fate was a horror, but the immediate physical threat of the curator was a fire that burned hotter. Survival instinct took over. "We can't outrun it anymore," she said, her voice hard, the vulnerability gone. "Not here. Not with Julian's ankle and Ben like this." She scanned the area, her eyes landing on the thick, thorny vine that had mimicked Zara's voice. "We have to stop it, here." Julian looked at the advancing creature, then at their pathetic state. "How? We're exhausted. We have no weapons." "It's just parts," Ben whispered, leaning heavily on Julian. He was staring at the curator, but his focus seemed deeper, his eyes slightly unfocused. "It's not alive, it's just instructions stitched together." The creature was halfway across the small clearing. It dragged its broken leg, the shattered bone making a wet, grinding sound in the mud. "The stitching," Maya said, her eyes narrowing. "The journal said it was held together with sinew and leather, if we can cut it." "With what?" Julian shot back. Maya didn't answer. She ran to the vine that had tormented her. With a cry of rage, she grabbed the thick, thorny stem and pulled. The thorns dug into her palms, but she ignored the pain, ripping a 3-foot section of the vine free from the tree. It was thick as a cable and covered in hooked, inch-long thorns. It was a primitive, brutal flail. The curator was almost upon Ben and Julian. Julian shoved Ben behind him and braced himself, his injured ankle screaming in protest. The creature raised its one good arm, its massive, composite fist ready to strike. "Now!" Maya yelled. She charged from the side, swinging the thorny vine like a whip. It wrapped around the curator's upraised arm. She pulled back with all her strength. The thorns dug deep into the patchwork of dead skin. The curator let out its metallic shriek and swiped at her, but the vine held it for a crucial second. "The leg," Ben gasped, his intuitive connection giving him a flash of insight. "The good leg, it's all that's holding it up." Julian understood. He let go of Ben, who collapsed against a tree trunk and launched himself forward in a desperate, clumsy tackle, aiming for the curator's one functional leg. He slammed into it, his shoulder hitting just below the knee. The creature was immensely heavy and strong, but its balance was already compromised. It staggered. It tried to shake Julian off, but he clung to its leg like a dog, his arms wrapped around the cold, leathery flesh. The curator looked down, its clicking slits focused on the man, disabling its mobility. It lowered its head and brought its fist down, not on Julian's head but on his leg, on the ankle he had already injured. The sound was a sickening, wet crunch of shattering bone. Pain, white-hot and absolute, exploded in Julian's leg. He screamed, his grip finally breaking. He fell away, his leg now a useless, twisted ruin. But his sacrifice had bought Maya the moment she needed. As the curator was distracted, she unwrapped the vine from its arm and swung again, this time aiming for the thick bundle of stitching at its shoulder joint. The thorns caught and ripped. She pulled again and again, her hands bleeding freely, shredding the ancient sinew that held the arm to the torso. With a final, desperate heave, the stitching gave way completely. The curator's one good arm tore loose from its body and fell to the mud with a wet slap. The creature was now just a torso and a head with one functional leg and one broken one. It stood for a moment motionless, its programming trying to reconcile its state. It was disarmed. It was crippled. Then it simply toppled over face down in the mud. It was not dead, but it was incapacitated, a heap of twitching, useless parts. Silence fell over the echo garden. The mimicked voices of the dead faded away, as if their audience was gone. Julian lay on the ground, cradling his shattered leg, beads of sweat on his forehead, his face pale with agony. Maya stood over the fallen monster, her chest heaving, the bloody, thorny vine clutched in her hand. Ben leaned against the tree, exhausted, his connection to the zoo's pain momentarily drowned out by the fresh, real agony of his friend. They had won. They had stopped the unstoppable, but the cost had been immense. And as the adrenaline began to fade, they became aware of a new sound. It wasn't the curator, it wasn't the plants. It was a low, collective hum coming from all around them. The whispers were returning, but this time they were not just sad or angry. There was a new tone in their voices, a sound of approval, a sound of interest. They had seen the violence, the desperation, the pound of flesh that had been paid, and they were pleased. Chapter 15. The New Audience. The whispers that rose from the echo garden were different. The chaotic, looping memories absorbed by the plants faded, replaced by a conscious, directed sound. It was the collective voice of the spirits, the true choir, and their tone had shifted from a general miasma of rage and sorrow to a focused, almost clinical curiosity. They had witnessed a hunt, a desperate battle, a sacrifice of flesh and bone. They had been given a performance and they were intrigued. "They're watching," Ben said, his voice a low tremor. He pushed himself away from the tree, his eyes scanning the impenetrable shadows of the garden. "They're not just angry anymore. They're assessing." Maya dropped the thorny vine, her bleeding hands leaving crimson prints on the ground as she pushed herself up. She looked at the twitching, dismembered curator, then at Julian, who was trying and failing to stifle a groan of agony as he clutched his ruined ankle. "We need to get him out of here. We need to find shelter, a place we can barricade." "There's nowhere," Julian gritted out, his face slick with sweat. "Every building here is their cage, their tomb. We're just moving from one cell to another." The whispers grew louder, coalescing around them. They were no longer just sounds. They carried a psychic weight, a pressure that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The voices were clearer now, individual threads in a complex tapestry of sound. A young girl's voice, Lena the Weaver, could be heard whispering about the patterns of blood in the mud. The guttural, angry clicks of Kosa, the silent hunter, echoed not with menace, but with a hunter's professional respect. They were being judged. "The infirmary," Ben said suddenly, his head snapping up. "It's near the reptile house. It's built of brick, solid." "The place where they experimented on people?" Maya asked, a fresh wave of horror washing over her. "You want to hide there?" "It's the one place they might fear," Ben reasoned, his logic coming in flashes of intuitive insight. "It's where Dr. Finch worked, her ghost. She's not one of them, she's something else, something they avoid. There was no better plan. Using a thick, straight branch as a makeshift crutch for Julian, they began the slow, agonizing process of moving again. Maya supported Julian on one side, Ben on the other. Every step was a fresh torment for Julian, his shattered ankle sending waves of nausea through him. As they left the Echo Garden, the whispers followed them, a mobile cloud of sound. They did not attack, they observed. The translucent forms of the Victorian tourists had vanished, replaced by the far more solid, shimmering outlines of the captives themselves. They stood among the trees, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence, their spectral eyes following the slow, painful progress of the three survivors. They were no longer a passive audience. They were judges at a grim tribunal, and the trial was far from over. Chapter 16. The Cold Comfort of the Infirmary. The infirmary was a grim, two-story brick building, its windows narrow and barred like a prison's. A small, tarnished brass plaque next to the door read, "Department of Anthropological Medicine." It was a sterile, euphemistic name for a house of horrors. The door was unlocked. They practically fell inside, the building's interior even colder than the night air. The smell was sharp and antiseptic, a chemical scent that had somehow persisted for a century, overlaying a faint, metallic odor of old blood. The front room was a waiting area, its chairs overturned. Beyond it, a long, tiled hallway stretched into darkness, lined with doors. As soon as they were all inside, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind them with a definitive thud. It wasn't the violent, supernatural slam of the founder's office. It was the precise, mechanical action of a well-oiled lock. They were sealed in. The moment the door closed, the whispers from outside ceased. The psychic pressure vanished. They were in a pocket of profound, unnatural silence. "Ben, you were right," Maya said, her breath fogging in the cold air. "They won't follow us in here." "They can't," Ben corrected, his eyes scanning the pristine, unnervingly clean hallway. "She won't let them." A faint, rhythmic squeaking sound began at the far end of the hall, growing steadily louder. A single, wobbly wheel. A figure emerged from the darkness, pushing a rusty metal gurney. It was a woman or the ghost of one. She was tall and severe, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a stained, high-collared nurse's uniform. Her form was semi-translucent, but her eyes were solid, burning with a cold, intellectual light. This was the spirit of Dr. Alva Finch. She did not seem surprised to see them. She pushed the gurney to the center of the room and stopped. Her cold gaze fell on Julian, who was now slumped against the wall, his face pale and clammy. Her expression did not change, but her intent was unmistakable. The gurney was for him. "What does she want?" Julian asked, his voice weak. "To help," Ben whispered, though his tone was filled with dread, not relief. "She was a doctor, her spirit. It's an echo of her purpose, her single-minded, obsessive purpose." Dr. Finch's ghost glided toward Julian. She reached out a translucent hand, not to attack, but to examine. Her icy, intangible fingers passed through his leg, and she tilted her head with the dispassionate curiosity of a diagnostician studying a slide. Her diagnosis was clear. The specimen was damaged and required immediate attention. She gestured again toward the gurney, a silent, implacable command. "No," Julian said, trying to push himself away. "Keep her away from me." "We don't have a choice," Maya said, her voice grim. She looked from Julian's ghastly pale face to the terrifying yet seemingly professional ghost. "You need a doctor, even a dead one." The choice was an impossible one. Let Julian suffer from his injury, or entrust him to the care of a spirit whose methods, according to Creedmoor's journal, involved phrenology, vivisection, and a complete disregard for the concept of pain in her subjects. The doctor's ghost waited, her patience absolute. The rhythmic squeak of the gurney's wheel was the only sound in the sterile, silent building. Outside, the choir of spirits waited, unable to enter. Inside, the surgeon was ready to begin her work. Chapter 17. A Doctor's Care. The decision was made by Julian's body. As Dr. Finch's ghost extended her hand in a second, more insistent gesture toward the gurney, his eyes rolled back in his head and he slumped into unconsciousness, his body finally succumbing to the shock and agony of his injury. "Help me get him up," Maya said to Ben, her voice firm. There was no other option. Together, they lifted Julian's dead weight onto the cold, rusty surface of the gurney. The moment his body settled on the metal, the ghost of Dr. Finch seemed to gain a new measure of solidity. She was no longer just a translucent specter. Her form grew more defined, her movements more precise. She had a patient. Her purpose was restored. She turned and began to push the gurney down the long, tiled hallway, its one wobbly wheel squeaking a grim, rhythmic cadence. Maya and Ben followed, their footsteps echoing in the sterile silence. They passed doors with small, grimy windows, catching glimpses of examination rooms, each containing a single, ominous-looking metal table with leather restraints. The doctor pushed the gurney into the last room on the right, the operating theater. It was a terrifying sight. A central operating table sat under a large, multi-bulbed surgical lamp. The walls were lined with glass-fronted cabinets filled with a nightmarish collection of antique surgical tools, bone saws, scalpels of unusual shapes, and complex, menacing-looking devices of steel and brass whose function was horrifyingly unclear. The ghost pushed the gurney alongside the operating table. With a strength that seemed impossible for an apparition, she single-handedly lifted Julian's unconscious form and transferred him to the table. She was eerily efficient. She then glided to one of the cabinets. The glass door swung open without her touching it. A bone saw floated from its hook and drifted through the air toward her. She took it in her translucent hand, and like her own form, the saw became more solid, more real. She was going to operate. "We have to stop her," Ben said, his voice a horrified whisper. "She's not going to set his ankle, she's going to amputate it. That's how they cured compound fractures." Maya looked around the room, her eyes searching for anything they could use. Her gaze fell on a heavy, iron stool in the corner. "Distract her." Ben nodded. He stepped forward. "Doctor," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, "the subject is unstable. You must examine his chart first." The ghost paused, the bone saw hovering over Julian's leg. Her cold, intelligent eyes turned to Ben. His words, though nonsensical in the context, resonated with her programming, procedure, protocol. She tilted her head, considering his statement. While she was distracted, Maya crept up behind her. She lifted the heavy iron stool, her muscles straining. She swung it with all her might, not at the ghost, but at the large surgical lamp hanging directly above the operating table. The stool hit the lamp with a tremendous crash of shattering glass and screeching metal. The ancient fixture, its mounting corroded by a century of neglect, tore loose from the ceiling. It fell, a heavy pendulum of iron and broken glass, directly onto the operating table. It did not strike the ghost. Dr. Finch, being intangible, was unaffected, but it landed on the table with Julian, the ghost's patient, her specimen. The table, old and rusted, collapsed under the sudden, violent impact. Julian's body was thrown to the floor, and the heavy lamp crashed down where he had just been, shattering the table and sending a shower of sparks across the room. Dr. Finch spun around. Her spectral face, which had been a mask of cold professionalism, twisted into a horrifying expression of pure, intellectual rage. Her experiment had been contaminated. Her sterile environment had been violated. Her specimen had been endangered by an outside variable. She let out a silent, furious scream. The glass doors of the instrument cabinets exploded outward. Every scalpel, every saw, every terrifying, nameless tool flew into the air, suspended around her like a halo of sharpened steel. They all turned, their sharp points aiming directly at Maya and Ben. The doctor's care had been rejected. Now the failed specimens would be dissected. Chapter 18. The Unthings. The cloud of surgical instruments hung in the air, a vortex of polished steel and murderous intent. Every blade was aimed at Maya, and Dr. Finch's ghost stood in the center of the storm, her form flickering with a cold, white rage. Her sanctum had been violated, her procedure interrupted. "This way," Maya yelled, grabbing Ben's arm and pulling him back into the hallway. The instruments shot after them, a swarm of metallic hornets. A scalpel whistled past Ben's ear, embedding itself deep into the wooden frame of the operating theater's door. A long, curved needle stitched itself through the sleeve of Maya's jacket, pinning her to the wall for a terrifying second before she ripped the fabric free. They ran, a hail of sharp metal clattering against the tiled walls and floor around them. They were being herded, driven back down the long hallway toward the infirmary's entrance. As they passed the doors to the other examination rooms, they heard new sounds. A wet, dragging scrape from behind one door, a frantic, desperate scratching from another. The spirits of the choir may have feared this place, but they were not its only residents. One of the doors, its wood rotten at the base, splintered and burst open. A creature crawled out, a thing that defied anatomy. It was a misshapen lump of pale flesh that moved by pulling itself forward with one grotesquely long, multi-jointed arm. It had no discernible head, only a series of weeping sores that seemed to track their movement. It was one of the unthings, the ghost of a failed experiment, a soul trapped in the memory of its own malformed flesh. Another door burst open, and a second creature emerged. This one, a frantic, skittering thing that moved on four mismatched limbs, its spine bent at an impossible angle. The infirmary was not just haunted by its doctor, it was infested with the spectral remnants of her victims. And they were all focused on Maya, and Dr. Finch's rage had roused them, directing their mindless, eternal agony toward the living intruders. They were trapped. The ghost of the surgeon and her cloud of flying blades were behind them. A growing pack of spectral abominations was in front of them. The main door was sealed. Julian. In the chaos, they had left him on the floor of the operating theater. "We have to go back," Ben said, his face a mask of grim determination. "We won't make it," Maya countered, her eyes wide with terror as a third unthing. This one a crawling torso that dragged its useless, fused legs, pulled itself from a room. Ben's gaze fell on a heavy fire extinguisher mounted on the wall. An idea, desperate and insane, sparked in his mind. They're ghosts, memories of pain, but she, he said, nodding back toward the furious specter of the doctor, she's a memory of order, of control. We can't fight her rage, but maybe we can fight her obsession with sterility. He grabbed the fire extinguisher. It was heavy, but his adrenaline was a powerful fuel. "When I go, get Julian." Before Maya could protest, Ben turned and charged back down the hallway, directly toward Dr. Finch and her storm of steel. The unthings, confused by this sudden reversal, paused in their advance. The blades flew at him. Ben raised the fire extinguisher like a shield, deflecting scalpels and forceps with a series of loud clangs. He squeezed the handle. A massive, thick cloud of CO2 and chemical retardant erupted from the nozzle, filling the narrow hallway with a billowing white fog. The effect on the ghost was immediate and profound. Her sterile, ordered world was suddenly filled with a choking, messy, unpredictable cloud. The chemical snow fell on her translucent form, and she recoiled as if struck by acid. Her rage momentarily forgotten, her entire being was consumed by a new, overwhelming obsession: the contamination. The storm of instruments faltered, the blades wobbling in the air as their master's focus was broken. It was the opening they needed. Maya didn't hesitate. She ran past Ben, back into the operating theater, the chemical fog swirling around her ankles. She found Julian, still unconscious, on the floor and began to drag him out, her muscles screaming in protest. Dr. Finch's ghost shrieked, a silent, furious sound that made the lights flicker. She ignored Ben. Her focus was now on the spreading cloud of filth. She raised her hands, and a powerful, invisible force began to push the chemical fog back, trying to contain the mess. Ben saw his chance. The main door was still locked, but next to it was a large, barred window, the same kind of window that was in every other room of this prison. He ran to it, hefting the nearly empty fire extinguisher. With a final, desperate roar, he swung it against the bars. Chapter 19: The Weight of the Choir. The iron bars on the infirmary window were set deep in the brick, a testament to the fact that this building was designed to keep things in, not just out. Ben swung the heavy fire extinguisher again, the impact a jarring shock that ran up his arms. A loud clang echoed through the waiting room, but the bars held firm. Behind him, Maya was dragging Julian through the chemical fog. which was now being compressed into a shrinking sphere by Dr. Finch's spectral power. The unthings, their master's attention diverted, had resumed their slow, agonizing crawl, converging on Maya and Julian from the hallway. "It's not working," Maya yelled, her voice hoarse from the chemical dust. "Keep going," Ben shouted back, swinging the extinguisher a third time. A hairline crack appeared in the mortar around one of the bars. Dr. Finch, in her obsession to contain the contamination, had gathered the entire cloud of fire retardant into a roiling, dirty ball in the center of the hallway. But now, her attention returned to the intruders who had caused the mess. With a flick of her spectral wrist, the instruments that had been wavering in the air shot forward again, a fresh wave of steel aimed at Maya's back. At that exact moment, the infirmary door did not open. It exploded. The heavy oak door was ripped from its hinges and thrown across the room, splintering into 1,000 pieces against the far wall. The force was so great it tore the window bars from their mountings, the brickwork crumbling around them. In the ruined doorway stood the shimmering, translucent forms of the choir, not one or two, but dozens of them. Kosa the hunter stood at the front, his spear a thing of solidified rage. Lena the weaver was beside him, her hands trailing threads of pure shadow. Behind them, a crowd of angry, vengeful spirits pressed forward, their collective psychic pressure a physical blow. They had been waiting, listening. They could not enter Dr. Finch's sterile domain, but they had felt the shift. They had felt Ben's desperation, Maya's fear, Julian's pain, and they had felt the cold, familiar aura of their old tormentor, the doctor, reawakened and enraged. Their hatred for her overrode their fear of her prison. The unthings, the broken remnants of the doctor's experiments, recoiled, screeching as the wave of powerful, coherent spirits washed over them. They dissolved like smoke, their fragmented memories no match for the focused rage of the choir. Dr. Finch spun around, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. Her private, ordered world had been breached by the chaotic, emotional rabble she had so despised. She raised her hands, and her cloud of instruments flew to meet the incoming spirits. The hallway became a battlefield of the dead. Scalpels and saws clashed against phantom spears and fists of shadow. It was a war between cold, sterile order and hot, chaotic rage. Ben and Maya stared, frozen for a moment by the sheer spectacle of the supernatural war erupting in front of them. The choir was not helping them. They were simply destroying a mutual enemy. Ben knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that as soon as the doctor was dealt with, that same unified wrath would be turned on them. "Now," Ben said, grabbing Maya's arm, "this is our only chance to get out." They scrambled through the ruined doorway, dragging Julian with them, stepping over the threshold from the cold, sterile prison of the infirmary back into the humid, living prison of the zoo. They were out of the frying pan and back into the fire. The battle of the spirits raged behind them, a silent, flickering light show of psychic violence. But as they moved away from the infirmary, the whispers started again, their tone now something new. They had seen the living fight. They had seen them bleed. And now they had seen the spirits of their own rising to fight alongside them. The assessment was over. A verdict was being reached. Chapter 20. The judgment of Creedmoor. They collapsed under the skeletal branches of a massive, dead tree 100 yards from the infirmary, the flickering light of the spectral battle still visible in the building's shattered doorway. Julian was barely conscious, his breathing shallow, a low moan escaping his lips with every pained breath. Maya was covered in scratches and bleeding from a dozen small cuts from the thorns and the flying instruments. Ben felt a deep, soul-crushing exhaustion, as if his brief connection to the choir had permanently drained something vital from him. "What now?" Maya asked, her voice hollow. "We wait for them to finish killing each other and then come for us." Ben looked back at the infirmary. The lights had stopped flickering. A deep, profound silence had fallen. The battle was over. "She's gone," he said. "They unmade her, tore her memory apart." As he spoke, the spirits of the choir began to emerge from the infirmary. They did not pour out in a rush. They exited one by one, their forms more solid, more defined than ever before. They had fed on the energy of the fight, on the destruction of their old tormentor. They were stronger. They formed a semicircle, their shimmering forms blocking any path of escape. They were no longer just watching. They were a jury, and court was in session. Kosa, the silent hunter, stepped forward. He did not speak, but his voice entered their minds, a dry, ancient sound like dust skittering across rock. "You bleed, you fight, you break, like us." Lena, the weaver girl, glided to his side, her voice a soft, sad whisper in their heads. "You came to this place of pain. You opened the book. You woke the engine. You are the cause." A third, larger spirit, one they hadn't seen up close before, the hulking, brutal ghost of Mr. Grick, the head zookeeper, emerged from the crowd. His mental voice was a cudgel. "Trespassers. You broke the quiet. You deserve the cage." The spirits were divided. Some, like Kosa, saw in the survivors a reflection of their own struggle. Others, like Lena, saw them as the catalyst for this new wave of suffering. And some, like Grick, saw them only as new prisoners for a prison that should never be empty. The final judge stepped forward. It was not a captive. It was not a zookeeper. It was a tall, impeccably dressed man in a Victorian suit, his face a mask of cold, intellectual arrogance. His form was almost perfectly solid, but his eyes burned with an unnatural, cold fire. It was the ghost of Augustus Creedmoor. He had not been in the choir. He had not been in the engine. His spirit, it seemed, was the one thing powerful enough to persist on its own terms. He had been watching all along, a silent phantom in his own mad creation. An interesting experiment, Creedmoor's voice echoed in their minds, smooth, cultured, and dripping with condescending amusement. "My curator has failed, my physician has been dismantled, and my choir has developed a sense of justice." He looked at Ben, a flicker of genuine interest in his dead eyes. "You, the anomaly, you carry the blood of the specimen but the will of the intruder. You silenced my engine." He turned his gaze on the other spirits. "They are not like you. They are not victims. They are a contamination. They unlocked the door to this sanctuary and let the world back in. The performance is over. They must be archived." Creedmoor raised a hand and a palpable wave of power washed over the other spirits. He was their creator. He was their God. His will was the law of this place. The spirits who had shown a flicker of empathy, Kosa, Anka's distant song, even Lena, recoiled, their forms wavering, their newfound strength draining away under his authority. The more brutal spirits, like Grick, grew stronger, their outlines hardening. The verdict had been delivered by the only judge that mattered. The survivors were guilty. Creedmoor looked at Maya, then at Julian's broken form on the ground, and finally back to Ben. You will not be destroyed. That is inefficient. You will become the new exhibits. The ghost of Mr. Grick stepped forward, a spectral set of iron manacles appearing in his hands. The hunt was over. The time for caging had begun. Chapter 21. The Founder's Hubris. Augustus Creedmoor's authority was absolute. The choir, which had moments before been a council of varied, angry wills, now fell into line, a silent, disciplined army under the command of its creator. The ghosts that had shown them a sliver of empathy retreated to the back of the spectral crowd, their forms dimming. The more malevolent spirits, Mr. Grick, the cruel overseers, the ones who had enjoyed their work, grew bold and solid, their dead eyes fixed on their new prizes. Mr. Grick's spirit glided forward, the ethereal manacles in his hands clinking with a sound that was both real and not. He was heading for Ben. "No," Ben said, his voice weak but firm. He struggled to his feet, placing himself in front of Julian and Maya. He was exhausted, drained, but the Founder's return had sparked a final, defiant ember in his soul. "You cannot resist the architecture of this place." Creedmoor's voice filled their minds, a calm, lecturing tone. "I designed it. Every stone, every bar, every blade of grass is attuned to my will. You are merely components in a machine you do not understand." "You're wrong," Ben countered, his voice gaining strength. "You didn't build a machine, you built a prison, and prisons have a weakness, the prisoners." Creedmoor's spectral form actually smiled, a thin, bloodless expression. "My dear boy, the prisoners are the fuel. They are the most vital part of the design. They have no will of their own." "That's where you're wrong," Ben said, and he closed his eyes. He didn't try to fight the choir. He didn't try to reason with Creedmoor. He did the one thing he had fought against since sitting in the conductor's chair. He reached out. He opened his mind, not just to the pain and the rage, but to the memories. He let the sea of suffering he had held back flood into him, not as a weapon, but as a connection. He saw Kosa, not as a captured warrior, but as a father, teaching his son to track an antelope across a sun-drenched plain. He saw Lena, not as a weaver of shadows, but as a young girl, laughing as she wove flowers into her mother's hair. He saw 1,000 stolen lives, 1,000 moments of love and peace and simple, human existence that had been ripped away and replaced with the cold misery of the zoo. And he broadcasted it. He became a psychic amplifier, not for their pain, but for their memory of who they were before Creedmoor had turned them into instruments. The effect was instantaneous. The disciplined, silent army of ghosts faltered. Lena looked down at her hands, no longer seeing weavers of shadow but the hands that had once held flowers. Kosa's spear of rage wavered, the image of his son's smiling face superimposed over the grim reality of the zoo. Their identities, which Creedmoor had so meticulously tried to erase, were flooding back. "Cease this," Creedmoor commanded, his calm facade finally cracking. A wave of pure, dominating will pulsed from him, trying to force the memories back down. "You are my creation. You are my choir." But it was too late. Ben had not given them a weapon, he had given them back themselves. And with their true selves came their true, focused, individual rage. It was no longer the chaotic, ambient anger of the zoo. It was the personal fury of 1,000 stolen lives, and it was all directed at one man. Kosa, the silent hunter, lifted his head. His shimmering form solidified, no longer a mere echo but a warrior burning with purpose. His mental voice was a spear. "You took my son." Lena looked at Creedmoor, her soft eyes now glowing with a cold, hard light. "You took my mother's loom." One by one, the spirits of the choir turned, their individual grievances uniting them in a way their shared suffering never could. They were no longer his orchestra. They were his accusers, his executioners. Mr. Grick, the zookeeper, still loyal to his master, lunged at Ben. But before he could reach him, a shimmering wall of spirits, Kosa, Lena, and a dozen others, materialized in his path. They did not attack him. They simply absorbed him. His form dissolved into theirs, his brutal, simplistic loyalty overwhelmed by their righteous, personal fury. Creedmoor's ghost stared, his arrogant composure finally shattering into something that looked like fear. He had lost control. His instruments had remembered how to play their own songs. The entire choir, now a single, unified entity of focused retribution, surged forward. They did not touch Creedmoor. They passed through him, a river of vengeful memory. With every spirit that passed through his form, a piece of him was taken away. His fine suit dissolved. His arrogant expression was wiped away. His very form seemed to shred, unraveling under the weight of 1,000 stolen lives. His final, silent scream was not one of pain, but of indignant disbelief. He was Augustus Creedmoor. This was his world. It was impossible that his own creations could unmake him. But they did. His spirit was torn apart, his memory erased, his power scattered and consumed by the very souls he had imprisoned. When the last spirit had passed, nothing was left. The founder was gone. Chapter 22: The Silence of the Cages. With Creedmoor's destruction, a new kind of silence fell. It was not the waiting, hungry silence of the hunt, nor the sterile, cold silence of the infirmary. It was a silence of release, of completion. The central, organizing principle of the zoo's evil was gone, and in its absence, the engine of hate that had run for a century finally sputtered and died. The spirits of the choir remained, but they were changed. The hard, vengeful edges of their forms softened. The burning light in their eyes dimmed to a gentle glow. They were no longer a jury or an army. They were just souls, finally at peace. Kosa, the hunter, turned to Ben. His form was already growing more translucent, his connection to the physical world fading now that his purpose was fulfilled. His mental voice was softer now, filled with a deep, weary gratitude. The cage is broken. The keeper is gone, but the gate is still a memory of iron. He looked toward the main gate, and Ben understood. Creedmoor was gone, but the physical and spiritual scars of the place remained. The gate was still locked by the memory of their imprisonment. They were free of the founder, but not yet free of his zoo. "How do we open it?" Ben asked, his own voice hoarse. Kosa's form shimmered. He raised his phantom spear and pointed not at the gate but at the founder's office, a dark silhouette on the hill. The heart of the machine must be stopped, not with silence, with truth. The spirits began to fade, their work done. They dissolved into the night air like smoke, their whispers a final, fatting chorus of thank yous and farewells. Within a minute, they were all gone. The three survivors were alone in the quiet, dead zoo. "What did he mean?" Maya asked, climbing stiffly to her feet. "The heart of the machine." "The corral engine," Julian said, his voice a pained rasp from the ground. Ben silenced it, but it's still there, the artifact. As long as it exists, the zoo's purpose, its song, is still written into the world. They knew what they had to do. It was a final, impossible task. Julian couldn't walk. Ben and Maya were at the absolute limit of their endurance, but they had to go back. Back to the founder's office. Back to the room where it all began. The journey back up the hill was a slow, agonizing pilgrimage. Maya and Ben practically carried Julian between them, his broken leg a dead, heavy weight. The zoo was quiet around them. The Echo Garden was silent. The Arctic exhibit was just a cold, broken building. The curator's dismembered body lay inert in the mud, just a collection of rotting parts. The menace was gone, replaced by a profound, empty sadness. They reached the office. The shattered window was a gaping wound. They climbed back inside, the room now feeling like a hollow, desecrated tomb. The safe, the housing for the corral engine, stood with its door slightly ajar, just as they had left it. A deep, resonant silence emanated from it now, the silence of a machine that was powered down but not yet destroyed. "The journal," Ben said, his eyes falling on the book where Julian had dropped it. He limped over and picked it up, his gaze falling on the last page of Creedmoor's frantic addendum. He read the final, scrawled words aloud. "Should the engine's purpose be corrupted and its operator fail, the core resonance must be undone. It cannot be destroyed by force. Sound cannot be broken by stone. It must be overwritten. It requires a new song, a story of its undoing, a truth." Ben looked from the page to the open safe. "It's a recording device," he said, a slow, dawning realization on his face. "That's all it ever was. It recorded their pain. We have to give it a new recording. We have to tell it what happened here, the truth." Chapter 23, A New Song. They stood before the cracked open door of the vault, the silent heart of the corral engine. It was not a monster to be fought, but a page to be written on. "I'll do it," Maya said, stepping forward. She raised her camera, the one she had used to bash the curator. The lens was shattered, but the red recording light still blinked with stubborn persistence. The audio recorder was still functional. "This whole time I've been trying to capture a story, the story of a haunted place." She looked at Ben, then at Julian, who was propped up against the desk. "But that wasn't the story. This is." She stood before the vault, held the camera up like a microphone and pressed the record button. She took a deep breath, and she began to speak. Her voice, clear and steady, filled the silent office. She did not speak of ghosts or monsters. She spoke of Zara Nader, a pragmatic professional who died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. She spoke of her bravery, of her anger, of the injustice of her erasure. She told the engine about the person it had consumed. Then she turned the camera to Julian. Propped against the desk, his face pale with pain, he began to speak. He spoke of Augustus Creedmoor, not as an occult mastermind, but as a vain, cruel man whose arrogance and pseudoscience had led to the suffering of hundreds. He dismantled the founder's philosophy, piece by piece, exposing it as nothing more than the pathetic, self-aggrandizing ramblings of a tyrant. He spoke the historical truth, stripping the machine of its dark, esoteric power and revealing its mundane, pathetic core. Finally, the camera turned to Ben. He did not speak of his ancestor as a victim or a ghost. He spoke his name, Kosa, and he told the story he had learned from his visions, the story of a father, a hunter, a man who loved his family and his home, a complete human being whose life had been stolen. He told the engine the truth of the souls it had used as fuel, giving them back their names, their histories, their humanity. He spoke of Anka, of Lena, of all the others whose names he now knew. He was no longer their conduit of pain. He was their historian, their witness. As they spoke, a low hum began to emanate from the corral engine. It was not the dissonant, threatening hum of before. It was a soft, gentle, resonant tone. The crystal and brass larynx at its core began to glow with a warm, white light. It was recording. It was learning. It was being overwritten. When they had said all they could say, a profound silence fell once more. The white light in the engine pulsed once, brightly, then faded to black. The hum ceased. A loud, metallic clang echoed from the bottom of the hill. It was the sound of the main gate's massive lock, disengaging. The heart of the machine had been stopped, not with silence but with truth. Their story, a story of survival, of sacrifice, and of remembrance, was now the final song the Creedmoor Zoological Gardens would ever hear. They helped Julian up, and together, the three of them, battered, broken, but alive, limped out of the founder's office for the last time. They walked down the main promenade, the first rays of dawn painting the gray, dead park in shades of rose and gold. They did not look back. They reached the main gate. The heavy chain lay in a pile on the ground, its lock shattered. The wrought iron gates, which had been a symbol of their imprisonment, now stood wide open, a welcoming archway back to the world. They stepped through, leaving the silent cages and the weight of the zoo's history behind them. They were free. The story was over, but they knew it would live on, not as a tale of ghosts and monsters, but as a quiet, indelible scar on each of their souls, a testament to the truth that the most profound horrors are not born of the supernatural, but are built piece by painful piece by the hands of men. The end.